Mirëmbrëma. Fushatat presidenciale në Shtetet e Bashkuara të Amerikës gjithmonë kanë vëmendje, jo vetëm kombëtare, por globale. Verdikti i popullit amerikan për president të ri do të thotë ndryshimi fateve edhe për shumë popuj e vendet e tjera anë mban botës. Sigurisht, është fuqia e shtetit amerikan që përcakton shumë zhvillime globale që nga marrëdhëniet korrekte për të ftohta me Japonin, luftën tregtare me Kinën, mbikëqyrjen e kujdesshme të diktatorit koreano verior, përplasjet diplomatike marrëdhëniet tërhiqe Moskput me Rusin, ruajtjen e stabilitetit në lindjen e mesme, ndihmat ekonomike për shumë vendet e Afrikës, marrëdhëniet speciale me Evropën apo emigrantet e paligjshëm nga vendet e Amerikës Latine. Në fakt, këto janë vetëm pak nga puna e Shteteve të Bashkuara në nivelin global, pasi ka dhe mira probleme të tjera, pa përfshirë çështjet e shumta të brendshme. Megjithatë, më shumë se sa për shtetet e mëdha e të forta, zgjedhja e presidentit të ri amerikan ndiqet me vëmendje të madhe nga shtete e popull të vegjël, siç janë në rastin ton ata ballkanik, ku padyshim bën pjesë edhe Kosova. Me 3 nëntor mbahen zgjedhjet presidenciale në Shtetet e Bashkuara dhe përballë kandidaturës së presidentit aktual republikani Donald Trump, nga demokratët këtë të drejtë e ka fituar Joe Biden, ish zëvendës presidenti amerikan, i cili shërbeu në administratën e presidentit Barack Obama. Në këtë rast, roli i rëndësishëm që kanë këshilltarët për kandidatët për president, jo vetëm për të fituar zgjedhjet, por më pas edhe në nivelet e larta të administratës, është shumë i madh. Michael Carpenter është një prej tyre, i cili përveç si këshilltar i kandidati demokrat për president Joe Biden, është edhe drejtor menaxhues i qendrës Penn Biden për diplomaci dhe angazhim global, si dhe një bashkëpunëtor i vjetër jo rezident në Këshillin Atlantik. Ai gjithashtu shërben në bordin e drejtorëve të fondacionit Jamestown. Paraprakisht, zoti Carpenter shërbeu në Pentagon si zëvendës ndihmës i sekretarit të mbrojtjes me përgjegjësi për Rusin, Ukrainën, Euroazin, Ballkanin dhe kontrollin konvencional të armëve. Ai gjithashtu shërbeu në Shtëpinë e Bardhë si një nga këshilltarët për politikë të jashtme të zëvendës presidentit Joe Biden, si dhe në Këshillin e Sigurisë Kombëtare si drejtor për Rusin, kurse më herët zoti Carpenter ishte oficer i shërbimit të jashtëm në karrierë me Departamentin e Shtetit. Andaj, sonte kam kënaqësinë ta kem në intervistë ekskluzive për Radio-Televizionin e Kosovës, zotin Michael Carpenter, këshilltar i lartë i kandidatit për president të Shteteve të Bashkuara, Joe Biden. Mr. Michael Carpenter, good evening from Pristina and thank you very much for your time.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
How is the election campaign going in your camp?
Well, I'm not a formal member of the Biden campaign, although I do informally advise the candidate. And if you look at the polls these days, it's a clear advantage for Vice President Biden. But, we're still 3 months out from the election, and so there's a lot of things that can change between now and Election Day.
Probably you will join that team very soon.
Well, that would be presumptuous of me to say, but I think Vice President Biden will certainly have a very capable team because he has had so many advisors over the past, his 36 years in the Senate and his 8 years as Vice President, that he's not going to be lacking for advisors who know Europe and who know the Western Balkans and Kosovo.
Yes, but if Mr. Biden will win the elections, what do you expect from him?
Well, I see a Biden presidency as one that is focused on greater engagement, first of all, in the region, in the Western Balkans as a whole, and specifically on the issue of the Kosovo-Serbia dialogue. What I think you will see is a much greater focus on aligning our strategic vision for what we want to achieve in the dialogue with our European partners. So what you've seen over the course of the last 12 months, maybe a little bit longer, is an U.S. policy towards the Kosovo-Serbia dialogue led by Rick Grenell that is completely at odds with the EU's policy. And this divergence of approaches has been singularly bad for both the outcome of the dialogue and also for politics in both countries, frankly. And so what I think you would see is a much greater emphasis on aligning both our strategic orientation, but also, frankly, our tactical approach to the issues of the dialogue.
Yes, and if Mr. Biden will win the elections, Mr. Carpenter, do you see that he's going to change anything towards Balkans?
Well, as I said, great engagement. I think much more emphasis put on working with our European partners to incentivize rule of law reforms and hopefully to spur greater economic integration of the region. One of the things that has been missing, I think, in terms of the process over the last maybe 5-10 years has been a real momentum in terms of economic integration. That is something that if we can bring the value chains in this region, integrate them more closely into European value chains, remove some of the obstacles to the communication and transportation links across the region, we can achieve a lot more. There will be a lot more alignment of business interests, of economic interests. That, together with smart diplomacy, can achieve a lot.
One of the biggest issues right now in our region actually is the process of normalization relation between Kosovo and Serbia, as you mentioned already. How do you see the recent developments on this process? I mean, if you can be more precisely.
Well, I think it's a step that both Kosovo and Serbia have resumed the dialogue after 20 months of hiatus. That's good. As I said, I was troubled by the fact that the U.S. approach was not synced with. It's a positive step that Chancellor Merkel and President Macron of France have really taken the lead in restarting the dialogue. I think there's still some problems with the structure of the dialogue. In particularly, I think the incentives for changing the status quo are very different in Kosovo and Serbia. And unfortunately for Serbia, the greatest incentive continues to be EU membership, which in and of itself requires a lot of very difficult reforms for the Serbian government. And so, I think what we're going to have to do is recalibrate a little bit that incentive structure so that there are things that Kosovo can benefit from in the near term. And I'm thinking here of visa liberalization, perhaps shifting some of the European countries away from non-recognition, the 5 non-recognizers, and things of that nature that will create a little bit more level of a playing field upon which we can build some of the economic links and other types of connections that will help push the dialogue forward. That's my view, at least.
But based on all these circumstances that you mentioned, do you see any possibility that Kosovo and Serbia to reach an agreement during the Trump administration?
I think it's highly unlikely. I think the Trump administration has taken the wrong approach. I wish Miroslav Lajčák and Josep Borrell a lot of luck and success in their efforts to restart the dialogue. But frankly, without the U.S. and the EU pulling in the same direction and really putting something on the table that's big, and I'm thinking here of something along the lines of a reconciliation fund that would bring considerable economic resources to bear to help with this problem, I don't see a lot of scope for success over the next, say, 6 months. Within the sort of 1 to 2 year time frame, I'm a little bit more optimistic, but it's going to take a lot of hard work and fundamentally an alignment between Brussels and Washington.
Mr. Carpenter, based on our past, should Kosovo continue to work with the EU or with US?
I don't think it's a choice of working with the US or the EU. I think in the future, Kosovo will have to work with both. And I think for the present moment as well, Kosovo should work with both. But unfortunately, until the US and the EU are more closely aligned in their approach to the dialogue process and integrate their strategies, the economic and the political and the diplomatic, I just don't see a lot of scope for a successful outcome so long as those strategies are disjointed.
As you probably know, Kosovo is facing now a process with the specialist chambers. The court was established during the Obama administration, actually. How do you see the recent development with the court, and what impact it will have in Kosovo's politics and relation with the dialogue?
Well, I don't know that it's necessarily going to have any relationship to the dialogue. I think the specialist chambers has a job to do, which is to enforce the rule of law, free of any kind of intimidation of witnesses or tampering with evidence. And it, of course, applies Kosovo law to uphold justice and accountability. And that's what I would hope from the specialist chambers going forward, that they would rigorously apply the rule of law as they move forward with, so far they have only discussed indictments. They have not actually handed them down. So the next step would be to actually have indictments handed down and then to have a fair and free process of administering the rule of law.
Yeah, probably you already know, but Vice President Biden worked for the last 2 decades with President Thaçi, and during his visit here in Pristina, he called him as the George Washington of Kosovo. How do you see the role of President Thaçi in Kosovo's politics and maybe in history?
Well, look, President Thaçi has been a towering figure in Kosovo politics, as you said yourself, for 2 decades. As far as the allegations that have been made against him by the specialist chambers, I want to see the rule of law play out. I want to see the process play out. I'm not going to comment one way or the other. Just as with any person who is accused of a crime, they are presumed innocent until proven guilty. And so let's let the process play itself out.
And what was the collaboration between Vice President Biden and President Thaçi like? From your perspective, of course.
Well, look, Vice President Biden has worked with every single leader of Kosovo since, in fact, before independence, since well before 2008. And so, he was obviously one of the key champions in the Senate of a strong U.S. role of an intervention to stop and prevent genocide in Kosovo in 1999. And so he has met with and discussed the future of Kosovo with every leader since then. And that, of course, includes President Thaçi, but it includes other leaders as well.
And how much do you think this cooperation impact the relations and friendship between the United States and Kosovo?
Well, look, the United States and Kosovo have a strategic partnership that goes beyond any one particular leader, either in the United States or in Kosovo. It is a partnership that is based on support for Kosovo's sovereignty, for its independence, for its democratic institutions, for its rule of law, and ultimately for a Europe whole, free, and at peace, where both Kosovo and Serbia are integrated into Euro-Atlantic structures. That is the basis for the relationship between Kosovo and the United States. And, of course, Vice President Biden is a key champion of that, but it's a relationship that goes beyond individual leaders.
There is a lot of talks about denying war crimes committed by Serbia and trying to change the past, especially for Kosovo and Bosnia and Herzegovina. What is your opinion on these issues?
Well, look, the region will move forward when there is accountability for war crimes on both sides. And obviously, the specialist chambers were established in The Hague in order to deal with crimes perpetrated in Kosovo during a particular period in the late 90s. And that is their function. There have been other fora, including the ICTY, that have had other mandates concerning the Western Balkans. It is my hope that all criminals who perpetrated war crimes will be brought to justice. Now, obviously, it's not as easy in certain jurisdictions as it is in others, and so it's incumbent on the international community and the European Union to insist that wherever there is evidence of a crime that has been perpetrated, that there is justice.
But how, Mr. Carpenter? How can we do that? Probably you know that President of Serbia, Mr. Vučić, was a minister of propaganda of Milosevic regime, and nobody took him or nobody asked him for anything.
Well, look, that same president of Serbia, Aleksandar Vučić, is also a leader who wants his country to be integrated into the European Union. That is his self-proclaimed chief geopolitical goal. And so if he wants that to happen, he has to establish rule of law in Serbia. That is one of the key bases. Perhaps it is, in fact, the primary basis upon which countries enter the European Union. They cannot become members unless they establish rule of law. And so it is up to the European Union to ensure that those criteria to establish rule of law are met. And that includes prosecuting crimes that have happened in the past, such as war crimes and other crimes.
But is it possible with him?
You know, I think it's possible if the Serbian government is truly dedicated to joining the European Union, then absolutely it is possible. You know, the unfortunate reality that we've seen over the last couple years is that there has been a bit of backsliding in terms of implementation of democratic norms in Serbia. And I have in mind civil society freedoms, media freedoms, particularly the treatment of journalists. There has been regression. And so that is a sign of, that is a cause for concern. But again, the primary lever, the primary instrument to hold Serbia to account has to be the EU, because that is what Serbia wants for its future. That's what the government says it wants. Obviously, Serbia has a limited relationship with NATO. We have a bilateral relationship with the United States, but we don't have the same leverage that the EU has.
Based on your biography, Mr. Carpenter, previously you served in the Pentagon as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense with responsibility for Russia, Ukraine, Eurasia, the Balkans, and conventional arms control. How do you see the role of Russia in the Balkan region?
Well, unfortunately, I see Russia playing a largely destabilizing role in the Western Balkans. I think Russia is quite happy with the status quo, which allows it to maintain influence in Serbia as the guarantor of Serbia's interests in the region, and also as the chief advocate of the policies of Miroslav Dodik in Republika Srpska. And so whether it's holding back Bosnia and Herzegovina's NATO aspirations or maintaining the status quo in Serbia, you know, I don't see Russia playing a helpful role. It was revealed quite clearly that Russian-linked oligarchs, Kremlin-linked oligarchs in the region played a role in opposing the Prespa agreement between North Macedonia and Greece. And so everywhere you look, you see that Russia is taking a stance that is opposing the greater Euro-Atlantic integration of the region, because I think Russia sees that as not in its interests. Obviously, the 2016 coup d'etat attempt in Montenegro is another very brazen example of this desire to prevent the countries in the region from pursuing their Euro-Atlantic integration. And so it's ultimately a very destructive role, and one that needs to be watched very carefully.
And based on your opinion, what should U.S. do in this case?
I think what the United States should do is what I said at the outset. We should be working with our European partners to integrate the region more closely, to do exactly the opposite of what I just said, which Russia tries to achieve, which is create links between the region, economic links, support reconciliation, support rule of law, support closer relations between the countries of the region and NATO and the EU, wherever possible, and prevent this sort of malign influence from gaining momentum.
The last question, Mr. Carpenter. How do you see the role of American Albanians in the United States?
Well, Albanian Americans are a very proud community who are active politically across this country. I certainly hope that they see this coming election as a crucial one, both for the future of my country, but also because of the implications it will have for Albania, Kosovo, and the entire Western Balkans. And so they are a very energetic community. I've spoken to many members of the American Albanian community, and they are politically motivated to churn out the vote and to play a role in this election, which I think is going to be very helpful.
Mr. Michael Carpenter, thank you very much, and hope to see you in Pristina.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you.